Now, you mentioned what you've written in the book. I know you've also written about the racial inequities in the prison system and how you benefited from those. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. There's so many ways to sort of dig into this. I think obviously we know a lot about what that looks like on the front end. I think that there's sort of a lot of understanding about the way in which Black and Brown communities are often over policed, and Black and Brown people are disproportionately represented in carceral populations, even for crimes that they commit at the same rate as white people, such as drug crimes. Drug use is relatively consistent among, various key demographics that are still arrested at very different rates. But that sort of disparity sort of snowballs behind bars, or it can, because in many states, including New York, prisons were built in predominantly rural white areas, which can often mean that a lot of the staff are white. And obviously, this is not true at every prison, but it is a dynamic that exists in many places where prisons were brought in as a sort of like jobs program for dying rural towns. New York's a great example of that, but that same dynamic happened in Texas and Nebraska, and some federal prisons also, operated that same way, where they were putting these prisons in rural areas that really wanted them. There was actually a really crazy phase in like the 90s where towns were competing with each other to try to get prisons, like showing up at prison board meetings in costumes and singing songs. There's a song on YouTube like "Is we or isn't we gonna get a prison?" when one town was like campaigning to get a prison. But these are all, white rural towns, and the result is that now you have prisons that are predominantly holding Black and Brown people that are situated in very conservative white rural communities. Again, that's obviously not descriptive of all prisons, but the location and demographic who's inside in many prisons. And there's been some interesting reporting on what that can mean on the ground. Among people behind bars, like we sort of knew that if you were Black or Brown, you were going to have a tougher time if you were housed at an upstate prison. And there were an awful lot of those. And the New York Times did some really great reporting around that in like 2016, 2017, I think, where they looked at disciplinary cases and parole outcomes at prisons that were predominantly white staff versus, system wide. And, their findings sort of, cohered with all the things that we'd anecdotally told each other behind bars for years. So that was really interesting to see. But, one of the upshots of that is that if that means that Black and Brown people end up being treated worse behind bars or are more likely to be subjected to discipline, you're seeing the same sort of over policing of those communities in the free world mirrored in the inside. And that means that they're more likely to end up in solitary confinement, lose their good time, be more traumatized, and end up doing more time for the same offenses. And then you add on top of that biases in parole boards, which have historically been predominantly white as well. And then on top of that, when people are released, they're still released back to dealing with the same systemic racism that would have haunted them before prison.